This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast.
Ooh, yes, baby, yes.
Man, it feels good to have you back. We are happy to have you here today. We're going to have one hell of a time.
Ooh, yes, we are. Get oiled up.
Now, to be kept up on what we're doing, feel free to follow us on Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We're also on TikTok. We're also on Facebook. And on our Facebook, we have a subgroup called Citizens of the Milky Way. It's just a place where anyone can post memes, funny stories, articles, questions, anything like that. We also post a few days early what our episode of the week is going to be there. Feel free to check that out at Citizens of the Milky Way. Now, here's the thing. We release a Creep Street episode once a week.
Yes, we do.
However, we understand that once a week is often not enough. You need more.
Yes, that is absolutely. It is. The FDA has said as such.
Yeah. Thank God we've come up with the solution, because we know y'all have just been screaming for it.
Oh, screaming and creaming.
It's over at patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast.
Yeah, baby.
There we have all sorts of bonus content that you will absolutely love. We're talking movie reviews, movie commentaries, interviews, conversations, short stories, full bonus episodes, and anything and everything in between.
Amen, mama.
We've got 3 tiers, a $2 tier, a $5 tier, and a $10 tier. So no matter your budget, we've got you covered.
Yes, and we have a new shout out. We have a new top tier Patreon subscriber to give a shout out to at the end of the episode.
That's right. That is right. Cannot wait to give that shout out. So happy to have you here. What a joy. Now, Dylan, last week we got started off with a spooky, scary story.
Oh, man. And people have been writing in. They've been saying, what the hell? That was scary.
Yeah, as they should.
And, well, we've got part 2 coming at you today.
Yeah, I need to know what happens next.
Well, let's find out, shall we?
Okay.
Today we are talking about The House That Screamed, Volume 2. And once again, my source for this was the book The Uninvited, The True Story of the Union Screaming House by Stephen A. LaChace. So let's dive in.
Okay.
So a brief little catch 'em up to where we left off last week.
Yeah.
Stephen and his 3 kids move into this house in Union, Missouri. Things go batshit crazy.
Yeah.
After tons of scary shit happens, they move out only to find that another family with kids is moving in. And that's essentially where we pick up in Volume 2. Now, a bit of time has passed. In fact, 3 years to be exact, and Stephen had actually heard that the house had been turned into a dog kennel since they left.
Okay.
And that the family they had seen before actually didn't move in.
Oh, okay.
Stephen wanted to make sure that his health was in order after him and the kids had been through such a hard experience, and he had a ton of tests performed, including stress test and even a CAT scan, both of which came back fine.
Good.
He also had a sleeping test performed and discovered that he had sleep apnea.
Okay.
Now, the doctor tells him that because of this, he's never able to get any kind of deep REM sleep. Well, Stephen, since leaving that house, had still, even though the haunting was gone, still would have these awful nightmares about the place. And then he asked the doctor, well, what do I do about my nightmares? And the doctor was surprised because the doctor said that he isn't able to reach a deep enough sleep to actually have dreams because of his sleep apnea, yet he still has these vivid nightmares. As we know, at the end of part 1, Stephen and his kids got the hell out of that house and moved into a duplex. They were definitely happy to be out of there, but even after leaving, the emotional scars they suffered were still present. For example, Stephen could barely sleep at night because he always had an awful feeling that someone was looking at him through his bedroom window. Even when he would close the blinds, he felt like there were still eyes on him. But one night, Stephen had a new nightmare that rattled him to his core. It was a nightmare in which this watcher presented itself. In the dream, Stephen awoke in the middle of the night with the feeling that eyes were once again upon him. He gets out of bed and goes to the window, and this time he actually sees something. In the darkness of the night, he could make out the form of a man. It was approaching his window, picking up pace as it went. As it gets closer, Stephen can see that this man has blonde hair, and the closer it got, he noticed the eyes. The eyes were solid white, no pupils, no iris, all white, and they glowed in the dark. The figure walked up and stood directly in the window looking at Stephen. And then crash, the window shattered as the entity began climbing into the room. As it climbed in, Stephen was horrified to see it now had a big smile on its face, showing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. Stephen screamed as the man pounced at him. Stephen pushed him aside, trying to run away, but as he did, he could feel the entity grabbing at his legs. Thankfully, that's when Stephen was awakened from his nightmare by the sound of his daughter shouting, "Daddy, wake up!" She could see he was having a nightmare. After which, Stephen laid in bed a while, unable to fall asleep, and was thoroughly shaken by the nightmare. At about 3 a.m., he decided he was going to sit down and write out everything he had experienced since moving into that haunted house. Keep in mind, it is now May of 2004, so Stephen is like, I hear all about forums and chat rooms online, so he decided to post his story to a few paranormal forums, hoping that maybe someone would reach out to him. After posting it, he went back to bed, and when he woke up in the morning, he checked his email and was stunned to see that he had over 100 emails since going to bed hours before.
Whoa, popular guy.
Yeah, people were fascinated by his story, and this was when he met a woman named Sheila. Sheila had reached out asking if she could drive to the property and maybe take some pictures of it, and he was like, well, sure. It's just a dog kennel now, so there shouldn't be any harm in that. Well, it was Sunday evening when Stephen's phone rang. He was surprised to find it was Sheila calling him, the woman he had met through the paranormal forums. Sheila told him about what had happened when she went out to take pictures of the place. She's like, I kept looking for a dog kennel, and I was confused because I was certain that I had found the place, but it wasn't a dog kennel, it was just an old white house. So she knocked on the door, and the woman who answered, she asked if she knew about a haunted house that was supposed to be in the area. And the woman answered her immediately, saying that this was the very house. Her name was Helen, and Sheila told her about Stephen's story, and Helen asked Sheila to give Stephen her number so that he could give her a call. So here's a bit of backstory about Helen and her family. She did not have an easy upbringing. She left her home when she was only a teenager. She married young, and her first husband was an abusive alcoholic. After she left him, she was then on her own with 3 kids. She actually found work at a state prison and enjoyed it. And as the years passed, she climbed the ladder and even was sent to work with juvenile offenders, which was her passion. When she met her second husband, a truck driver named Charlie, 2 of her children were already grown up and out of the house, and her third child would soon be leaving as well. Charlie was also previously divorced, and his 4 kids were grown up and about to move out as well. So the couple got married, and they had a child of their own, a daughter named Kelly. One winter day, Helen had a nasty fall on the steps of their home and cracked a few ribs and injured her foot. Unfortunately, this would put her out of work for the next several years while she was in rehabilitation. She had even given up her job at the juvenile corrections facility, which she always hated doing and always regretted it. Therefore, as she worked towards rehabilitation, she became a stay-at-home mom. Of course, this only put financial stress on the family as well, and on top of that, one of Helen's daughters, Patty, had also married an abusive alcoholic, and after having 3 kids with him, she also got a divorce. So now she and one of her kids moved in with Helen and Charlie, and while the other 2 stayed with their dad. But they were relieved when they saw an ad in the paper advertising a house in Union. The same ad, exactly word for word, that Stephen had saw. So here we go again. So this introduces the second family. We met the LaChaces.
Okay.
Now we're meeting this new family.
Okay. Damn, I mean, it's like a lot of the time it's the family already has some, some rough stuff going on.
Absolutely. And Charlie, he also had problems with some of his kids. I know one of his kids that mentioned had a drug addiction that was really hard. And when they found this house, they thought it was kind of a break for them.
Right, yeah.
So one morning, after much internal debate, Stephen decided, you know what, he was going to call Helen. Knowing that there were kids there who might be attacked by the evil in the house, he felt he needed at least to reach out and see what was going on. Helen picked up the phone almost immediately as she had been waiting for his call. She told Stephen about everything that her and her family had been experiencing, and Stephen was in awe. It was almost exactly everything that his family had experienced, if not even worse. Like Stephen's family, they had been hearing footsteps, voices, whispering, various other noises, the feeling that there was someone in the room with them when there was no one there. The hair on all her daughter's dolls had been cut, and her daughter was adamant that she did not do it. Helen had even gotten a little kitten, and when she took her granddaughter upstairs to see it, she was horrified to find the kitten dead, its neck and back having been broken. No idea how it happened.
Oh my God.
Fortunately, she didn't let the granddaughter see the dead kitten, but they still had no idea what had happened to it. I know, freaky stuff.
Jesus, that's insane.
Everyone, there are parts of part 2 that get really dark.
Oh, God.
And I'll give you a heads up before they happen. But it didn't stop there. One night when Helen was alone at home, Charlie was working and the kids were staying the night at her daughter's house when suddenly there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find it was the police. The police told her that they had received a call from this house from someone who was threatening to commit suicide. Helen certainly didn't make that call, and she was home alone. Who made that call? The gutters on the house would also randomly catch fire.
What?
The transformer outside the house would blow up like every couple of months.
Oh my God.
Worst of all, one day she found her grandson bruised and bleeding at the bottom of the stairs. He claimed someone had pushed him down the stairs, someone he could not see. She felt like she had no other choice but to send the boy to live with his father, who was the abusive alcoholic.
Oh God.
But she felt he was in even more danger staying in this house. To top it off, she said that every time she left the house, she felt like someone was watching her from the upstairs window. Remember that in the last episode.
Oh yeah.
Her husband, Charlie, sort of believed her, but he was very much in the camp of, we just have to ignore it, sort of thing. So Stephen and Helen decide the 2 of them would go to the local library and courthouse to see what they can find out about the place and the land that it sits on. Now, the folks at the library were not helpful. In fact, they got the feeling like the people there were going ahead of them and removing things from shelves so they couldn't see them.
It's weird.
They referred to what they were looking for as just old wives' tales. The same thing happened at the courthouse, but despite all the hurdles they had to jump through, they were able to learn about the house and the land somewhat. The house itself was purchased from a Sears kit that came from a company catalog. The railroad dropped it off there in 1936. Quick side note, because I had no idea what that meant. I had never heard this before, but between 1908 and 1940, Sears sold over 70,000 homes.
Oh.
I guess they offered over 400 styles, and you'd pick it right out of a catalog.
Oh.
The land itself, though, had a far darker story. Now, this is, keep in mind, we're going to be talking about some just nasty stuff.
Yeah.
It was once part of a property that was owned by an Army officer named Captain John T. Cromwell. He was a slave owner, and the land on which the house sat, the exact area where the house stood, was actually the exact spot where the slaves' quarters were. Across the street was a house that had come to be known as the murder house after a woman murdered her husband there and took her own life back in 1971. On the corner was a big gray house where only 5 years ago a man shot himself right in front of his young son. Also, the nursing home that stood on a hill just down the road was once an infirmary during the Civil War, which means that it was a place that saw a lot of death and misery. And after that, it became a place that housed those who were desperately sick with contagious diseases such as TB and everything else. And the people who died there were often buried in unmarked graves. But some of the darkest history revolved around Captain Cromwell, who lived there with his second wife, Minerva. Not only was he an officer in the Union Army, he founded Missouri's first militia in the Civil War. He was even the town's sheriff and judge. Oh, but it keeps going.
Okay.
He was apparently a 33rd degree Mason, and from what I can tell, was essentially king of the town. On top of all that, he was also the head of the town's morals committee.
Oh, God.
And they did exactly as the title suggests. When someone in the town did something bad, they were the ones to pass judgment. And this is only what we know about him for certain. It's said that on one occasion during the war, he lined up 400 Confederate soldiers and executed them. And it's later said that Confederates executed 6 soldiers on the same land as retribution later on. So now keep in mind, Cromwell may have been fighting for the Union Army. They were the side fighting for the abolition of slavery. But even though himself, he was a slave owner.
Weird.
Apparently, he was known to play both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
He was apparently a terrible person who may have even participated underground in the slave trade. So even though he was fighting for the Union, he was playing both sides, whichever side would pay more, essentially.
Right, yeah.
Basically, Stephen implies with his book that I used as my source that the folks at the library and the courthouse were so shady about the history of the places because they wanted to keep Cromwell's dark history a secret. Who knows? And let me just make it a point to say, I'm only getting this from Stephen's book. I don't know anything about Missouri's history, especially during the Civil War, or anything about this man. I'm only speaking to what was written in Stephen's book. So
Right.
I'm sure there's probably even more dark stuff about this guy that I don't know of. But like I said, I'm just going off what Stephen wrote. I didn't get this from a history book.
Yeah.
So things with Helen's family just keep getting worse. Kelly had begun showing signs of depression and aggression. She had even begun cutting herself. She'd begun to hear voices that told her to harm herself and others. And Stephen asked Helen if she wanted him to help her through this, and she said, yes, please. After some searching, they found a psychic named Betty who actually worked as a tour guide at a famous haunted mansion in St. Louis, Missouri. The book doesn't mention the mansion's name specifically, but I'm almost certain it's referring to the Lemp Mansion, a very famous haunting that we will definitely cover. Many folks have actually written in to request it.
Oh, okay.
They got to the mansion and introduced themselves to Betty and joined the group as she gave a tour. And apparently they had a paranormal experience while on the tour. At one point, Betty asked everyone to turn off their flashlights. The only light in the room was a single candle sitting in the center of it. Betty stood by it and began speaking to any spirits who may be present. As she did, the room suddenly became icy cold. A light caught their eye. Down close to the floor was a white glowing fog about the size of a dog that began drifting into the room. It drifted by their feet, and then one of the other people on the tour got scared and turned on their flashlight, and it was gone. And Betty sort of broke contact, and that was the end of the tour. Now, after the tour, they chatted with Betty and explained to her everything they had been going through with the house. Stephen talked about his experiences, then Helen told her story, and Betty agreed to help them, and in addition to that, she strongly recommended that Stephen be a part of this. She said he was carrying baggage still from his experience with the house, and that by doing this with Helen, it would help him as well. The agreed-on night that Betty would come and do a walkthrough was set into place. Well, the day of the investigation arrives. Stephen arrives before Betty, and remember, he has not come back here since he left. He never thought he would step foot in the place again, and he sort of has to work up the courage to even walk into the house. But after pumping himself up, he's able to go inside. Betty arrived right at 8 p.m. along with an assistant of hers named Lee, and immediately on entering the place, Betty could tell there was something there that was not happy she was there. They escorted Betty and Lee through the first floor of the place, and then they went upstairs and into all the rooms, then to the basement, the cellar. Then they headed back up to the second floor and were headed into the back towards the breezeway of the house when all of a sudden, Stephen and Helen felt what seemed like a cold burst of energy brush past them, and they watched as Betty was lifted about 3 inches off the ground and then thrown against the wall. Composing herself, Betty told Stephen and Helen to go downstairs as her and Lee continued their investigation. They had brought with them EMF readers. EMF stands for electronic field meters. You've probably seen them a lot in ghost hunter shows. They detect electromagnetic phenomenon, and when they do, they let off this whining sound. And Stephen and Helen could hear it squealing as they would come across energies. Apparently, when they went into the basement, the EMF readers were going off nonstop. Once they searched the whole house, they sat down with Stephen and Helen to tell them what they had learned. They said upstairs there was a man who quite aggressively told them that this was his house and everyone needed to get out. Next, they talked about the basement. Betty told them that there was a vortex in the basement from which spirits could come and go freely. She said it was very dangerous, and she said that they should either move or just avoid the basement and the upstairs altogether. So they chatted for a while longer, and eventually Betty and Lee said their goodbyes, and they would never return to that house again.
Wow.
Now, this is where it's gonna start getting real crazy, Creep Street.
Okay, here we go.
Sometime later, Stephen was awakened early one morning by the phone ringing. It was Kelly calling. She was in a panic. Kelly was talking so fast that Stephen could barely keep up. She said that she had been on the porch that night on the phone with a friend. While she was chatting, she hears something stir in the trees to her left. She tells her friend she'll call her back and hangs up the phone. And she saw what seemed like a shadow crawling around in the tree at a quick pace. Remember in last week's episode in part 1, when a shadow jumped down from the tree and chased Stephen and his brother. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Then she began to hear what sounded like a baby crying. And to her horror, she saw a baby in a white dress hanging from the tree by its feet. Kelly screamed and ran inside to get her mother, but when they returned, it was gone. That evening, Stephen came over. Charlie was working the night shift, so it was just Stephen, Helen, and Kelly. Stephen's kids stayed with their grandparents. They sat on the porch and waited to see if anything would happen. There was the occasional flash of lightning and the dull rumble of thunder in the distance. There was a storm approaching. Eventually, they began to feel the first few drops of rain. Now, they had been waiting out there for what felt like hours, seeing nothing. But on one occasion, when the lightning flashed again, they saw it. In a brief flash of light, they were able to see a baby in a white christening gown hanging upside down from the tree. It was clearly dead. For several moments, they stared at the child in horror. The wind and rain was now picking up as the storm got closer, and coming to their senses, they ran inside. They stood inside, barely able to even speak. They're just trying to process the horrific thing they had just seen. Periodically, they would look out at the tree, but obviously now the baby was gone, as if it was never there. The storm itself was pretty quick, and after about 30 minutes, it was just a simple rainstorm. Several moments go by, and something catches their attention. It's a noise. From outside on the street, they could hear someone humming, followed by the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of footsteps. As the humming continued, they thought it almost sounded like the voice of a child. As it continued, the humming, they whispered to each other, frozen in terror. "Do you hear that? What is that?" Stephen slowly turned his head to peer out the window screen, looking into the dark for whoever was humming. He couldn't see anything. They could only hear that humming and the tap of dancing feet. Stephen summoned up the courage to speak to it. It sounded like it was a child, so he said, "Do you want to come play?" Then they heard a giggle and the tap, tap, tap of the feet. Stephen pressed his face closer to the window screen, pressing his face right up against it. He called out again, "Do you want to play?" The humming stopped. All was silent except for the gentle tap of falling rain. Then a deep, violent, guttural growl roared right into Stephen's face from the other side of the window screen. Stephen is sent back, reeling. It was unlike anything they had heard before. Then all was silent again. Stephen decided he was not about to leave Helen and her daughter alone until Charlie came home from work. Freaky, right?
Ooh, I mean, this is getting rough. I mean, dang.
A few days pass, and once again, Helen calls Stephen in a panic. She says that something she can't see is growling at her, and that it sounds like it's getting closer. So Stephen gets in his car and races over there. Immediately, he can feel that electrical charge and the smell of sulfur and rotting flesh. The growling had stopped, but Helen was clearly shaken. As she was explaining to him what had happened, both of them were startled by the sound of an animalistic growl in one of the other rooms.
Slowly, Stephen worked up the nerve to go look. He slowly approached the room from which the sound came, only to find it empty. As he's walking back to Helen, the basement door violently swings open. So he quickly grabs it, slams it shut, and locks it. Just as he does that, the animal roar came again from that room he had just checked. So slowly again, he makes his way back to the room. Standing outside it, Stephen called out, "What do you want from us?" To which they heard the roar again, and as it did, the basement door once again flew open right after Stephen had securely locked it. Once again, there came a roar so loud it seemed to rattle the whole house, and then all fell silent. Both Stephen and Helen now went to the living room where they sat, still shaking with terror, trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. That was when Helen said she had something she needed to show Stephen. Pulling up her sleeve, she revealed a large red bite mark that was all bruised. You could see where the teeth had even punctured the skin. Helen said she had no idea how she got the mark, but only that it happened while she slept. So freaky.
Oh my God. I mean, the bite mark thing, that is always an issue.
Always an issue, friends.
Oh God. I mean, fuck.
Ugh. Over the coming months, Stephen and Helen would be visited by all manner of investigators, psychics, and mediums, and the vast majority of them, the book says, were wildly incompetent, if not downright scammers. Most of them would say, yes, the place was haunted, but there wasn't anything harmful, and all they needed to do was just not feed it their fear, which easier said than done.
Yeah, it's like just telling someone to not be scared. You're like, okay, well,
okay, thanks. None of them were any help, and things were only getting worse. It was clear that Helen's mental and physical health were being worn down. Every day, there were new bite marks and scratches. Well, enough was enough. Stephen was going to form his own group to help Helen. He assembled a team that included a psychic named Alex and his sister, a photographer named Mary, a tech guy named Mark who had tons of surveillance equipment, and a sensitive named Carol. Thus, MPR, Missouri Paranormal Research, was formed, and they were gonna get to the bottom of this.
Let's go.
From then on, there was usually at least one member of MPR at the house with Helen almost around the clock. Helen's health was really taking a hit. There had begun to be a bleak trend where right before a paranormal event, her blood pressure would drop and her pulse would drop, sometimes to less than 40 beats per minute. On one occasion when Stephen was there, they heard a noise upstairs, so they quickly rushed up to the second floor. Once there, they found themselves face to face with a large black mist. It hovered above Stephen, and he could feel the evil emanating from it. Staring at it for several moments, it suddenly began to swirl and then faded away, out of sight. Stephen passed out from the shock, but luckily hit a nearby bed on the way down, which kind of softened the fall. As days went by, they encountered all manner of weird shit. Mark, the surveillance guy, had recruited someone to help him with tech stuff, and this guy was huge, very big guy. He was in the basement, and he pulled on the fruit cellar door to make sure it was securely shut before they set up the camera. It seemed to be shut tight.
Okay.
When he turned around, he heard the sound of the cellar door opening and scraping the cement floor. He turned around to find himself face to face with a large figure in a black hood and cloak. Its eyes glowed red. It entered into the basement from the fruit cellar and approached Mark as he screamed, nearly losing his mind. And then it vanished. Creepy things like this were now happening on a daily basis in the old White House, and now they had even begun to take on weird sort of religious tones.
Oh.
One day, Helen was out and missed a call from her mother. And her mother, her mother's name and number were there on the caller ID. So she called her mother back later. She asked Helen what the strange outgoing answering machine message was, what that was all about. Helen didn't know what she was talking about. Her mother said that a woman answered the phone when she called, and all it did was quickly say the Lord's Prayer and then hang up.
That's so creepy.
So creepy. Another time, Stephen and Helen were on the second floor headed to the breezeway when they felt a gust of wind blow by them, and they heard a low, guttural voice say, "Jesus." What was going on? Now, this is where things began to get more violent and more dangerous and begin to even border on possession. A few days later, Stephen was awakened early one morning when Helen called him crying. She said she had been feeling this growing rage inside her towards her husband and began feeling like she could kill him.
She had an old walking cane that was her father's, and she said she kept having these visions of her bashing his head in while he slept. But that wasn't all. Later that night, Helen awoke to see her daughter Kelly standing at the foot of her bed. On her face was a look of rage, but she stood there in rigid stillness. Things were getting more and more dangerous, almost like Paranormal Activity.
Yeah.
So imagine this look of rage, but they're like standing rigid still.
Ooh,
That's
God,
creepy.
That's so horrifying. Ugh.
It was becoming very apparent that they needed to bring in the big guns, so Stephen began researching, trying to find a priest to come help them. He remembered hearing of a priest named Father Ken Sparks who had helped with a famous haunting, and they got in touch with him on a phone call, and after telling him of everything that had been going on, Father Ken had no doubts they were dealing with something demonic.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it.
He explained to them that they needed to find a good priest who could conduct the proper blessing. And he explained to them what must be done step by step. I think Father Sparks, he must not have lived nearby, so he kind of had to help from a distance,
Right.
sort of thing. Finding the right priest, though, was not going to be an easy thing to do. Helen was raised Baptist and didn't know the first thing about the Catholic faith. And Stephen had, of course, avoided religion altogether after his sister's death. After some research, they reached out to a priest, and on a Sunday morning, they attended his mass at church. Stephen noticed that Helen appeared visibly uncomfortable during the service. It was as if the scripture and the prayers were hurting her, like...
Yeah, like the whatever was at the house was like...
saying, I don't like it here.
He was like a part of her. Like she's possessed, this kind of.
Exactly, right. Not nearly as drastic as like Annalise Michelle.
Yeah. Right.
Like she wasn't making a scene and had to be removed, anything like that. But it was clear she was like visibly uncomfortable. After Mass, they met with the priest in his office. He was about in his 40s, very welcoming, happy to hear their story. He was moved by what they had gone through and agreed to come out and bless the house. The day of the blessing comes and the priest stops by, but immediately upon entering the house, it was apparent he was uncomfortable and even afraid. The blessing lasted no longer than 5 minutes. He sprinkled the water and said a prayer, and Stephen and Helen would have to even ask him to go do the upstairs, various rooms. He seemed intent on getting out of there. He did it, but he did it very quickly, and when he was done, politely said, God bless, handed them a plaque, and left the house. Before he even reached the car, the banging sound on the second floor began again, and they knew this was far from over. So they immediately called Father Ken Sparks and updated him on everything, and Father Ken said it sounded as though the priest had been scared off.
Oh, God. Classic.
To their surprise, Father Ken then suggested that they attempt to bless the house themselves.
Nope.
I know, right? Well, they had to decide what to do next, and Helen awoke one morning to something awful. Some time ago, Kelly had gotten a hamster as a pet, and she loved this hamster. She took very good care of it and made sure it had all that it needed. One morning, they realized they hadn't heard the familiar noise of the hamster running in its hamster wheel. When they went to check, they found that the hamster's cage was empty. But how did it get out? They started looking around, and that's when Helen looked down at her feet to find a hamster skull lying on the floor. Listen to that again, a hamster skull.
The skull.
Like it was something that had died long ago. The hamster was just fine the night before.
What?
And they never found the rest of the body. What could have been done to that hamster?
Oh, my God.
So now the kitten,
Jesus, this
Yeah.
is crazy.
That very evening, a group of ghost hunters were coming over to do an investigation. Among them were a couple named Bill and Trudy, a husband and wife from another town. They were nice people, and Stephen felt like he knew Trudy from somewhere, and after some thought, they realized they had actually been classmates all the way back in 5th grade. Trudy was a sensitive and over the years had honed her abilities, and Bill had a special knack for catching EVPs, and we know what those are, of course. On this night, Bill was performing an EVP session, and he asked, "What is your name?" And that's when they captured what sounded like the voice of a little girl saying, "The one." So he asked another question. "Is there something you'd like to tell Trudy or me?" To this, they got a response from then what sounded like the voice of a grown woman, saying, "His point of view is distracted." Later, they listened to that same EVP in reverse, and it seemed the woman was saying, "Why don't you come and find me?" Side note, the book says that apparently listening to EVPs backwards is a way of locating suspected vortexes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Joining them also that night was another married couple, Marie and Evan. Marie was also a sensitive like Trudy, and Evan was actually a skeptic, but after a few hours in the screaming house, he became a believer. Marie was experiencing things almost immediately. As she was walking up the stairs, she was pushed from behind, and they all saw it happen. Moments later, Marie saw a strange man walk into the bathroom. She quickly ran to the bathroom to check, only to find it empty, of course. Also joining them that night was an entire Christian women's group.
Oh.
The goal was to have people stationed in almost every area of the house in order to monitor the activity and find out where it might seem to be focused. Marie and Evan were upstairs. Stephen, Bill, and Trudy were in the basement. Helen and a few others were on the main floor, and the Christian women's group were all in the backyard. With everyone at their posts, the experiment began. The first thing to happen was in the basement, where they felt it becoming rather hot, and they could feel what felt like an evil presence. They even felt someone touch them. Recording on the EVP, they asked if the basement monster was with them, and they got the immediate response of yes. While this was going on, the women's group in the backyard started to feel uneasy. The wind had picked up, and they were feeling that strange electrical shock that other people had been feeling, and they also felt that they were not alone. They felt like they were being stalked by something in the darkness. And eventually they got too freaked out and ran back to the house, and as they did, they felt like they were being chased. One woman in the group, who had a digital camera, summoned the courage to quickly turn around and snap a photo. Everyone in the house heard the sudden entrance of all of them coming inside and knew something had happened. Everyone gathered to see if anything was caught on the camera, and when they looked, they all jumped back in terror. According to my source, on the right side of the photo they took, they captured an image of a vortex and a mass of entities entering through it. One in particular appeared to be an old woman, a witch of some kind, and she was looking directly into the camera. There was an entire ritual being performed. Examining the photo, they claimed they saw a mass of entities surrounding a burning cross. It was some kind of a blasphemous image of the crucifixion. Gross stuff. They stood there in horrified silence. This haunting was now officially demonic. Freaky stuff. While all this is going on, everything and everyone outside of the situation of the house were doing great. Stephen's kids were doing very well in school. They were really happy. And because they had experienced the haunting firsthand, they were totally understanding why their dad was investing so much time and energy to it. But at the house, it was around this time that mysterious puddles began to appear on the carpet. We've heard this before. Large dark spots would appear on the carpet. Helen would shampoo them, and the next day they would be back. Stephen and some of the others even pulled the carpet up to see if it was coming up through the floor, and there was nothing. The rug looked brand new underneath. By now, everyone involved with the investigation had begun to have awful nightmares. One evening, Helen was watching a friend's 4-year-old daughter, which, side note, why the hell are you agreeing to watch someone's 4-year-old daughter when all this shit's going on?
Yeah, no,
fucking
that was
stupid.
Yeah, people are fucking dumb as shit.
That's fucking stupid.
Yeah.
But that's not part of the story here, but just wanted to say it's kind of fucking dumb.
Yeah.
Well, the girl was sitting on Helen's lap as they were watching TV, and that's when the 4-year-old girl began to shake and whimper. Pointing with her little hand, she kept saying the word clown.
No.
Remember Matthew seeing the clown?
Yeah.
Well, this was weird because the demon clown thing was actually the one thing that Stephen had kept to himself from the others. He had always assumed that Matthew obviously had seen something, but maybe the word clown, monster, or whatever, was just his way of putting a face to it.
Right.
He didn't specifically think it was maybe a clown.
Yeah.
But this little 4-year-old girl is saying clown. So just an FYI, this next part gets very dark.
Okay.
So Marie, who was on the investigative team, apparently had a big phobia of clowns. But she was very happy at this time because her daughter had recently announced she was pregnant, and they were very happy about it. The night before her daughter's first checkup with the doctor, Marie had a nightmare that was beyond horrifying. In it, she found herself standing in the side yard of the Union House. There were all these people gathered there, and they were silently looking up at something, like there was something on the roof, but Marie couldn't see it. She joined them to see what they were looking at, but she couldn't get anyone to talk. They were all just looking up, and that's when, from behind her, she heard a giggling sound. Turning around, she saw a demonic-looking clown with red eyes that glowed. In its hand, it was holding a baby by the ankles. Laughing maniacally, it began to bash the baby on the ground over and over. Maria screamed at the others to help her get the baby away from it, but no one listened to her. They all just stared quietly upwards at something on the roof that she couldn't see. Marie screamed until she was awakened by her own screams. Later that day, when they went to her daughter's checkup, they were devastated to learn that there was no heartbeat.
Oh my God.
Awful. I know that's a very dark, just wanted to preface that. That's just kind of, a pretty dark moment. So
yeah, Jesus.
Heavy stuff, gang. Heavy, heavy stuff. The next day at 4 a.m., Stephen was awakened by the ring of his phone. It was Helen, and she was in a panic. She could hardly breathe. She had just experienced something so bizarre. Helen explained that her and Charlie went to bed early the night before, and during the night she was awakened by the sound of her own voice. She was talking in her sleep, and she noticed she was talking with no emotion in her voice, almost like she was in a trance. When she opened her eyes, she realized there was a figure in a black cloak and hood sitting on the bed. She was talking to the hooded figure, and Helen just remembers herself saying to the hooded figure, "I can do that." When she realized what was going on, she screamed, and when she did, the hooded figure vanished. Well, remember, up until this point, Charlie had been a bit of a skeptic, but that all changed when he saw a specter firsthand.
Oh.
He too woke up one night to see the same dark hooded figure at the foot of the bed. Helen woke up too to find Charlie laying in bed, terrified, and she talked with him and helped him process what he had just seen. About an hour later that very same night, Helen was awakened again, but this time by the sound of a low, deep growl. Standing near her bedroom window was a wolf-like creature. It stared at her, growling, its eyes glowing a strange yellow color. She froze in terror. In the corner of her eye, in the other corner of the room, she could tell the shadow figure was standing there. She heard it speak in a low, demonic voice. It said, "I'm here." Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, both the shadowy figure and the wolf were gone. All that remained was an awful, foul odor. Helen got up to splash some water on her face, and as she's going to the bathroom, she was startled when she sees Kelly standing rigidly on the stairs, standing rigidly still. Speaking to her, Kelly seemed to snap out of the trance. She didn't know why she was there, and she just went to bed. Looking at the clock, it was 3:15 a.m.
Yikes, there it is.
Once again, this next part is really rough. It's not that long, it's very quick, but this next part's a little rough, so everyone knows. Over the next few nights, Helen would actually be sexually assaulted by this hooded figure.
Oh, God.
It would happen at least 3 times.
Oh, my God. What in the fuck?
I know, it just keeps getting rougher and rougher. It was around this time that Helen's behavior also began to do a complete 180. The once kind and welcoming woman would suddenly have these violent outbursts of cruelty. She began telling Stephen that she thought Charlie was having an affair and that if she could find definite proof, she was gonna kill him. She's telling Stephen this one night as they're sitting in the living room, and suddenly the room was lit up by a bright flash of blue light from outside. They thought that the transformer had blown up again, so they got up and went to the porch to see what was going on, and they see a large, black, wolf-like creature standing in the middle of the road. Helen confirmed that that was the very creature she saw standing in her room at night. Not thinking, Stephen took off after it and ran as it turned down an alley. Stephen followed, and in the alley he came face to face with it. It growled and slowly approached him. Stephen stumbled backward and fell to the ground. Growling one more time, the creature turned and ran away into the dark. Stephen couldn't believe what he had just seen. Once back at the house, Stephen didn't mince words. He was like, "You and your family need to get the fuck out of this house."
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because I know that moving is hard and you can't just move, like it's expensive. I know it's not like you can just not everyone can just leave. But it's like you gotta get out.
Gotta find a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And this would actually be the last week that the family would be there.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Later that week, Stephen got a disturbing call from Helen. She had become convinced that Charlie was having an affair. She wanted to kill him. She said she had come up with an idea of picking Charlie up for lunch and then killing him.
Oh my God.
Here's where it gets even weirder. She said that Kelly and her friends even helped her pick out a knife.
What?
They wanted her to do it. They were encouraging her to. She said that she picked up Charlie from work and went to a secluded area. When she asked him and confronted him if he was having an affair, of course he denied it. She kept asking, and he kept denying. That's when she pulled out a knife that she had hidden under the driver's side seat, and she slashed at him a few times. But Charlie, even though he did get a little cut up,
was able to get out of the car and run away.
Oh my God.
As he ran, she tried to run him down with the car.
Oh my God.
But he got away. Of course, he did not come home that night. On top of that, Helen had all sorts of fresh bruises and bite marks on her. Stephen had heard enough and convinced Helen that he had to take her to the hospital.
Yeah.
Stephen rushes over to Helen to take her to the hospital. When he pulled up, Kelly and 2 of her friends were outside hanging out by the car. Stephen's walking towards the house and he gives a polite wave to Kelly and her friends, and that's when he realizes that all 3 of them were standing rigidly still.
Oh no.
And they were snarling at him. Stephen knew that they had to get out of there, so he rushed in, and the moment he did, the loud banging sound on the 2nd floor began. Helen was just kind of mumbling to herself, almost in a trance. Stephen had to really shepherd her to the door. Standing on the other side of the door was Kelly and her friends, still snarling. They spoke to Helen in awful ways, saying, "Where you going now, bitch? You gonna give me some money, bitch?" Things like that.
Oh God.
A lot of bitch thrown around.
A lot of bitch talk, okay.
Getting Helen in the car, he got her out of there and on the way to the hospital. Stephen drove her to a mental health facility, and after much discussion with the doctor, Helen agreed to have herself committed. She was truly afraid that she may hurt herself or someone else, so they agreed that this was the best idea. But it wasn't easy, and Stephen was heartbroken having to do it. Now, who knows if this was something supernatural or if Stephen was just so consumed with anxiety and fear, but on his way home, he somehow had gotten on the wrong side of the highway and nearly died in a head-on collision.
Oh my God.
Pulling over to the side of the road, he was able to pull a U-turn and get on the right side of the road, but he knew whatever this was, he was reaching a breaking point. While at the facility, Helen would have some very strange encounters, and her own behavior got even wilder. There was one patient at the facility who used to ambush her, holding a Bible and shouting Bible verses at her, claiming she was of the devil and that she was damned.
Dang.
This person would often break free somehow from their room and ambush her. In phone calls, Helen would tell Stephen that she was afraid to divulge anything about her experiences, afraid they would think she was nuts and she'd be stuck there forever. But randomly on these calls, Helen's personality would switch and she would begin cussing out Stephen, saying the absolute worst things. Absolute worst things. On one occasion, she even ripped the phone off the wall.
Oh.
But there was a good thing that happened as well. Helen finally summoned the courage to tell her doctor everything she had experienced in the house, and to her surprise, he believed her 100% and told her that they were going to help her and she would get better. In fact, she was told she didn't have to stay at the facility. A few days after being checked in, she was able to check out, and they had arranged for her to meet a priest named Father Paul. Father Paul had been recommended to them by a paranormal investigator named John Zappis, who would be very helpful throughout the case. Helen would not return to the house in Union. She instead stayed with her daughter in the nearby town of Gerald. When Stephen picked Helen up from the hospital for their meeting with Father Paul, she was already looking better. They were excited for their meeting, as Father Paul was well known for his knowledge and his kindness. Immediately when they met him, they knew they were in good hands. He listened to their story and right away said they were definitely dealing with something demonic and most likely several demonic entities. Father Paul then asked if he could pray for them. Placing a hand on both their heads, Father Paul began a blessing. For a brief moment, Stephen felt as though he couldn't breathe. Then he saw what he described as these quick flashes of white light. The next thing he knew, he was feeling a sense of calm and peace and relaxation unlike anything he had felt before. Looking at Helen, he could tell she felt the same. Driving home that evening, they both began to cry happy tears. For the first time, they were excited that they could actually overcome this. Some time passes and both of them feel much better after this blessing from Father Paul. It was now almost Halloween, and Stephen had planned a trip with the other members of the NPR group he had formed, and they were going to this closed-off road that had gotten the nickname Zombie Road. It was always said to be haunted, and at the end of the road, there was actually a little train track and a train that would take them back into town. Stephen was surprised when Helen asked if she could come along. He was hesitant, but he thought, hey, maybe a night out would be just what she needed. He would find out that was very wrong. Along the walk down Zombie Road, they actually came across a few specters, or so they claim. First, they saw what appeared to be a ghost of a farmer in overalls. He looked like he was from a time well before theirs. Another time, they saw a shadow figure come running down a hill at them. They stood their ground, and right when it got to them, it vanished. But that is when things got ugly. Helen's personality once again changed, and she started lashing out at Stephen and everyone else. Her eyes looked black, and her voice was low and gravelly.
She started saying that she was going to kill herself and everyone else. Stephen was able to wrangle her and get her into the car and get her home. In the driveway, Helen continued to berate him, calling him every foul name you can imagine. Stephen looked around outside the car and realized they were surrounded by tall, shadowy beings that seemed to be closing in on them. In a panic, Stephen tried to turn on the car to get out of there, but that's when Helen pounced on him. It took all of Stephen's strength to push her back on her side of the car, at which point she got out of the car and told him to fuck off. All the other members of NPR had now seen this behavior for themselves, and they were convinced it was demonic. Late the next afternoon, Stephen got a call from Helen's daughter, whom she had been staying with. She said that morning she took her mother to church and she was acting outrageous. One moment she was crying, the next she was angry and shouting and cussing. She had to get her out of there and take her home. When they got home, she kept acting bizarre. Suddenly, she just grabbed the car keys and ran to the car and drove away. Her daughter had no idea where she was or what she was doing. She was terrified that Helen might hurt herself or someone else. But fortunately, later that night, Stephen was called again by her daughter, saying that Helen had just showed back up at home and was in a great mood. She had no idea about how she had been acting previously that day. The next day was Halloween, and it was to be the final showdown. Stephen got the kids ready and out the door for school. At around 8:30, there came a violent knock at his door. Stephen looked out the window to see it was Helen. She saw him too, and she was clearly holding something behind her back. Outside, she screamed as she banged on the door, telling Stephen to open the fucking door and let her in. Stephen and his kids had recently gotten 2 cats, and as he walked to the door, he was stunned to see that the cats were standing in front of the door, their backs arched, fur standing on end, and they hissed as though they could sense something evil on the other side of the door. Stephen decided it was best not to open it. He grabbed the phone, deciding it was probably best to just call the police, but as he grabbed the phone, he could hear Helen get into her car and speed away. Just then, the phone rang again, making Stephen nearly jump out of his skin. It was Helen's daughter. She was frantic. She told Stephen that if her mother came to the door to not let her in, she had a gun with her, and she was going to kill him. She said she was going to kill him. Thank God he didn't open that door. She asked if Stephen could call her to talk her down, so he did. When he called, Helen answered in a rage, saying that she had a gun to her head and was going to kill herself. Stephen tried talking her down, and she finally said she wasn't going to shoot herself, but rather hang herself in the basement from the butcher's shower. She confessed her original plan was to shoot Stephen and then go home and hang herself. That's when, over the phone, Stephen could hear someone knock on the car window. It was her daughter. She said, "What did you do? Did you call my daughter, you fucking prick?" And Stephen was like, "No, you did." And with that, Helen almost seemed to snap out of it. She couldn't remember calling her daughter. Stephen told her to look at her daughter's face and see the sadness in her eyes. This was what she was doing to their family, and if she loved them, she needed to get the right help. With that, Helen lowered the gun and began to cry. This would be the darkest moment in the story. From here, Helen would only improve. Over the next several years, Helen would undergo much psychiatric evaluation as well as undergo various consultations with Father Paul. There would be days, of course, where there was sometimes regression, but overall, Helen would begin the journey back to wellness. Stephen would improve as well, and as the days of the old white house were farther and farther behind him, he once again found his faith in a higher power and began attending church again regularly. But sometime later, in December of 2005, Stephen would once again see the exact same ad, word for word, advertising that house. When he did, it sent a chill down his spine, but this is even stranger and more chilling. Out of the blue one day, Stephen received an email from Carl Winters, the eccentric old landlord, someone he had not spoken to in years. Here is what the email said.
The new children are having fun running around upstairs and screaming as children do when they're having fun. But I bet the parents will stop that soon when they finish moving in and get unpacked. When the kids first got there, they immediately ran up the stairs as little tykes do. They began running in and out of the rooms, screaming and laughing with joy. It was so nice to hear little angels screaming. I hope their guardian angels will watch over them.
And this is from the epilogue. This is what Stephen has to say about that email from
that's
Carl
weird.
Winters.
Little angels screaming. With that said, he didn't need to say any more. I had my answer. The one remaining question that I had about the whole experience was answered with those 3 little words, little angels screaming. Was this Mr. Winter's way of mocking me, celebrating his victory? The question was answered. I believe that not only did Mr. Winters know what was going on in the house, he was feeding it families. Fresh meat for the lion hiding in the cage, and his favorite was the children.
And that is where our story ends.
Wow. So we think that, like, this Carl Winters guy, I always want to call him Carl Weathers, by the way, but Carl Winters, like, knew about this the whole time and
was essentially this is what Stephen thinks, was essentially bringing the house victims.
That's crazy.
Now, keep in mind, I think almost every name and stuff is changed in this book. So I've even heard that Carl Winters might have actually been a woman, too. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But, like, Charlie, I think I heard his name was Emmett. So, like, you know, a lot of these names aren't their real names. I just went with what was in the book. But what a terrifying tale.
Wow. And, like, the fact that it affected so many different people and that, like, oh God, and then Helen was so deeply affected by it. I mean, what a scary story.
Freaky,
oh my God.
Right?
Yes. Dylan, thank you so much for doing all of that fantastic research. What a scary couple of episodes and an enjoyable couple of episodes as well.
Yes. Well, Maureen, I've got a list of names of little angels I'd like to give a shout out to.
Okay.
And we've got a newcomer.
Yay.
Folks, give it on up for our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream, James Watkins, the Finnish Face via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Vivacious Vicky McHugh, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker Bex Martin, the notorious Nicholas Barker, the terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the loathsome Johnny Love, the carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the killer stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the awfully awesome Annie, the murderous Maggie Leach, the Sir of Sexy Sam Hackworth, the evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the maniacal Laura Maynard, the arch nemesis Aaron Bird, the sadistic Sergio Castillo, the rapscallion Ryan Crum, the beast Benjamin Huang, the devilish Chris Doucette, the psycho Sam, the electric Emily Jiang, the ghoulish Gerd Hankum, the renegade Corey Ramos, the crazed Carlos, the antagonist Andrew Park, the monstrous Michaela Schur, the witchy wonder J.P. Weimer, and the newcomer, the freaky Ben Forsyth.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, Ben. You are so welcome here. We cannot thank you enough, and we hope you enjoy all of the great bonus content over there on the Patreon that you can, get from the back catalog, and I hope you're going to enjoy, the new stuff that's going to be added here soon.
Absolutely. Of course, please like, rate, subscribe, tell your friends, your family, and loved ones, evangelize the good name of Creep Street.
Yes, leave a review, 5 stars, any of that. It means the world.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night and goodbye.
Goodbye.